Dear unborn, you never came and I did not seek you out. It's hard for me to imagine you. I don't long for you. You will not remember me. If given the choice, a hard life isn't worth living. The world will forget us the moment we are dead. In years of being unavailable to myself, I was certainly not available to you. I wouldn't know how to help, guide, or protect you in this world. The most loving and best thing in my power to do for you has been to choose not to bring you into existence here. I know that being a mother would make me miserable. I think you would deplete me. I would protect you and love you and give you the world, but I wouldn't be happy, and I think you would know. Every reason I have thought of to have you has been selfish, and that's not fair to you. To bear a child under a spell would be a very selfish act. I hope you stay just the way you are because that's how I love you. A distant idea. Love, Mother Realist.
Welcome back to the podcast. This is episode number 2.
Yes.
And the archetype or the theme of this episode is the realist, the archetype, the realist. And we have a wonderful, wicked smart, so cool guest joining us today, Peggy O'Donnell Heffington. She is a badass.
Yes.
Before we introduce her, let's talk a little bit about the realist. What are the characteristics of the archetype realist?
I mean, this one is really intense.
Yes.
I love this one, honestly. It gets me when I get to that last part where it's like, I hope you stay just the way you are because that's how I love you, a distant idea. Oh, I can feel that in my chest.
I know. Me too. It helps me remember the practical, realistic reasons that I continually chose not to have a child. And so many of the lines in that letter remind me of that. And one of them is that last line that you mentioned.
Yeah, this archetype is like, it's kind of brutal, but it's like, these are some of the main themes I think that have come up through this, like people being like, I had to think through this all the way to the end, like play this out in my head. What was this really going to be like if I made this choice? So, yeah, let's talk about the archetype.
Yes. So the archetype of the realist. This archetype embodies pragmatism. This archetype is grounded, practical, and people who might resonate with this archetype, they prioritize facts, they prioritize logic, they want evidence-based reasoning for their decision-making process. They are rational, skeptical, they're critical thinkers. They accept reality, no matter what that reality is. They are efficient, resilient, and adaptable. And, are very adaptable, very thought out, skeptical, pragmatic folks.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, our guest today, I think this interview lines up really well with this archetype and this theme. She has written a book called Without Children, The Long History of Not Being a Mother, which is a very fact-based look at the history of women making this decision. Her name is Peggy O'Donnell Heffington, and she is a Senior Instructional Professor in the Department of History at the University of Chicago. She teaches historical research and writing methods and some gender and women's history. And this is her first book. So I guess, yeah. How did we find her?
Yeah, I think we found it on a Google search. We found her book on a Google search. But this book came out in 2023. And so it's very new. It's very fresh. And it was huge in our research. Peggy really does a good job of clearly, succinctly explaining the long history of not being a mother. And there are, I highly recommend this book. There are so many interesting facts, history that will blow your mind, history that will make you very angry, history that will make you laugh, history that will make you cry, and history that will make you happy. There's a little bit of that in there. But she's so funny, she's so witty, and again, she's so smart. I can't recommend this book enough.
Yeah. And this conversation was just amazing. Let's just get to it. Here's Peggy. Here's our conversation with Peggy. Enjoy. Oh, hi, Peggy. It's nice to meet you.
Hi, so nice to meet you. Thank you for having me on.
I'm so excited that you are here and you were unknowingly and indirectly a part of this, but now you're directly.
I'm so glad. I mean, it must be really powerful for people to like find community around this. I certainly found just in researching the book that that finding women in the past who had also found the decision fraught was incredibly comforting. That it's like, you know, there's nothing new under the sun, and you know, this experience has been shared with women for decades and centuries. Was incredibly comforting. So I imagine in the present it's all the more so.
Yeah. Do you feel like you today have a community around you for this?
I mean, being an academic, it is maybe for sort of unfortunate structural reasons, it is not uncommon for women to not have children. And certainly as a graduate student, I found that like the assumption was that you wouldn't rather than that you would. And so that is sort of part of the reason why I ended up writing the book was just trying to figure out like how for some people it became so obvious that, you know, having a child required more explanation than not having a child, like how we created a world in which that felt true for many people.
Yeah.
And so sort of accidentally, just by dint of my profession, I am around a lot of people who don't have children or who have, you know, who are pregnant in their early 40s with the one they're going to have. You know, I don't really know anyone in my professional space and my social space for whom this was not fraught. My sister was very not fraught. She has 3 boys and is incredibly happy about it. It was never a question in her mind. But it is much more, I'm much more used to people having this as like a really intense internal debate about whether they're going to do it or not and how it's going to fit into the life that they want.
Yeah, that's that makes a lot of sense. And hopefully these people are also saying it out loud. I think what we found, all of us were like, the first couple weeks of the Marco Polo group, people kept saying, am I allowed to say this out loud? Am I allowed to say this out loud? You know, that feeling like, oh, I'm telling a secret. So, I mean, that was really great insight already. Yeah, like you said, to the first question, and what inspired you to write the book. What about just personally? Was it more of like a personal thing, or were you just like looking at the larger picture and saying, no one's actually like done this research?
It was a personal experience. So like I said, I was in grad school at Berkeley. So I was surrounded by graduate students and tech workers, and basically no one, you know, certainly in our late 20s, early 30s, it was not really on anyone I knew's radar that they were going to have kids anytime soon. And then I graduated from Berkeley, and my first job was at the United States Military Academy at West Point, which is on a military base. And most of the faculty there are Army officers. Most of them are men. And so my peers, effectively, my female peers were their wives. And virtually all of those women had 2, 3, 4 children. They were all my age. They were all college educated. It was like a very startling contrast for me. And that got me thinking about, as I was saying, you know, what are the things that make it obvious that you're going to have a large family versus not? And I found that I wasn't satisfied with it just being a question of desire, that like grad students at Berkeley just don't want kids and Army officers' wives just do want kids. It seemed to me that there had to be something else going on. And as I spent that year there, I started thinking about, okay, what are the structural factors here? And you know, being an Army family means that you have subsidized housing, you have free healthcare, you have subsidized childcare. And also because they they move a lot. There are these like very organized groups of largely of women that sort of greet new families as they arrive and provide really material support for them. You know, I can't count how many times I heard women say to somebody, you know, like, my door is literally always open. So if you're up in the middle of the night with your baby, like, just come by. I always have coffee on. And I was, you know, I was just really struck by those being sort of precisely the things that don't exist outside of that context. And then so I started thinking, okay, so these are like structural and policy factors that make it possible for people to have large families. And then people who don't have those sort of support networks, which are financial and economic and also like material, like people to help them, you know, it becomes a much harder question. And so that was where I started the book, that, you know, this is the thing we usually talk about as a question of desire. But I was like, I think it's also about the context in which this decision is made. And then, of course, I'm a historian. So I started thinking, you know, this can't be, you know, there must be a history of this. There must be a history of the contextual, or I was going to say the contextual context, the context in which people made reproductive decisions, and also how we created a world where for many people it feels harder to have children than it does to not. And so I started researching, and the thing that I found was so interesting was that the same reasons that women say they're not having kids in the present, which I said, you know, were financial, professional, like their jobs, their support systems, these were all reasons why women in the past didn't have kids. Like, you know, there are long histories to all of these reasons. And so that was kind of what got me going with the book.
Oh my gosh, I love that so much. It makes me think, actually just today I was thinking about, because I sent my husband the link to the Surgeon General's warning. Do we know about, everyone knows about the Surgeon General's warning about me?
No.
Okay, Surgeon General just released a warning about the health risks of being a parent.
I did see this, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, it's hysterical. It's also heartbreaking. And it's a lot of it because of this, like, no one has help. There's no community. There's no, where's the village, you know, that kind of thing.
Right.
And I was just thinking today, like, how much of this is, like, I say it's a desire, I say it's a choice, but how much of it is such a like deep subconscious knowing that it would not be sustainable, that it's not possible, you know, like, sometimes I'm like, I don't know, something in me is kind of saying, actually, no, this is a bad idea for you just because of the surroundings in the world that you're in and whatever your background or whatever. So that's really interesting. Yeah. Just seeing the stark difference between colleagues and then Army wives. It can't just be that simple.
Right.
Really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, I don't know, I'm sure you're familiar with Sheila Heti's book, Motherhood, where her sort of semi-autobiographical narrator is wrestling with this question of whether or not to have kids. And she has this line that like lives rent-free in my head, where she says, you know, I think I would like to be a mother in a state of nature, but in the society we have that I would have to mother in, you know, it's just not something that I'm interested in. And I think that for me, that gets at something really deep, because sure, the desire question is part of it, and I imagine many of the women that you've come in contact with through this project would say, and you know, that they are like joyfully choosing a life that does not have children. But I found that in my own experience and anecdotally, and then certainly in the past, that for many people it wasn't that simple. It wasn't a pure question of desire. It was about like the context in which the choice has to be made, and I think that complicates the idea of choice, because it you know, it suggests that everyone is not just like choosing the life they want most from a buffet of equal options. They are actually looking at the life that they have and their finances or their job or the support systems they have or the environment, and making a choice that is sort of contingent on that context. And I think understanding that helps us better understand the picture of people not having children today, that it's not just people want children less than they used to. It's that we've created a society where it is hard to have children.
Right. And you've touched on so many things that that we want to touch on, and we'll come back to a lot of this stuff too. I think this is such a rich, complex topic, but something that we do want to really dive into this podcast is language. And you mentioned the word choice and how much of our language surrounding women and families, how much of that needs to shift. And you point out in your book, we don't have a word for women without children. We have a word for women with biological children, which is mother. But for women who don't have children, it feels like we're still figuring out what word or words to use that are accurate, that don't have a bunch of baggage, like child-free. But even that sort of implies that people who are child-free don't like children, which is not, or child-free by choice, which is not the case. Like, I love kids, but I like kids more than adults, you know? And child-free by choice, there's that word choice, child-free, a childless, you know, implying that there's a lack of something. But just the word choice, like you mentioned, there's so much more to it than that. And the binary qualities of a lot of this language, it's just not helpful. It can be oppressive. And you wrote in your book, expanding the definition of mothering is the key to transforming our society for the better. I love that. Could you speak a little more about language and just how that needs to shift, how it's been used? I know it's such a huge, I mean, we could have a whole podcast on language, but just a little bit about the need for shifting and expansion of the terms that we use.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It was something I really wrestled with in writing this book. Like, what word do I use to describe this thing that I am talking about? And as you mentioned, the two words that we kind of have are childless and child-free, and they both imply something, I think, very specific. Childless meaning that, you know, you lack something. Though I think this summer, childless has maybe been reclaimed a little bit by Taylor Swift, you know, where you have people sort of more willing to identify as childless, as a neutral identifier. But I think the history of that term is to imply a lack of something. And then, of course, child-free has been, you know, I think enthusiastically adopted by people looking for a positive identifier. But as I write in the book, there's a very specific history to that term. And it really emerged in the 1970s. So it wasn't something that I felt like I could use to describe this longer history. It also didn't really feel like it fit what I was talking about, because I was talking about everything from people experiencing infertility to people joyfully choosing a life without children. And child-free doesn't really feel like it encompasses that whole range of experience. I mean, if I'm being honest, the term doesn't really feel like it fits my own experience. So in writing the book, I tried to use relatively neutral descriptors, and that's the title. I mean, without children, it is a person without children. That is about as neutral as you can get, but it is also clunky. I also tried to say things like a person who experienced infertility or a person who decided not to have children. But we don't really have a equivalent to mother for you know, a woman who doesn't have biological children. And this is something, this sort of expanding of the word mother has been something I've been thinking a lot about this summer in the context of the sort of J.D. Vance childless cat ladies comment that got a lot of airtime in, you know, the last month and a half or so. Because, of course, that conversation is centered on Kamala Harris, who does not have biological children, but very much considers herself a mother and considers herself someone who does mothering in being a stepmother to her two stepchildren. And I think it's been really revealing that she has been, you know, singled out by the right as someone who is not a mother, because that suggests that their definition of what it means to be a mother is someone who probably, you know, what they mean is a specific biological act. And in the right's opposition to even things like IVF, they mean like a very specific, like, I'm scare quotes, natural biological act. that is how one becomes a mother, that it is, that it is not through the social role one takes on. And I think that is like a really narrow way to think about how you can care for the next generation. It also it doesn't describe the experiences of so many people who do acts of care work for young people that very appropriately could be called mothering. And that could be stepmothers, but it could also be neighbors. It could also be grandmothers. It could also be the ways that we interact with our siblings' kids, like as aunts. So one of the things that I wanted to show in the past was that the definition of mothering was maybe more flexible, that in the past and elsewhere in the world, the range of people who could care for a child and raise a child were far more than just the person who gave birth to the child. And this is true, like I said, basically everywhere else in the world, but even in American history, in colonial U.S., mothers and women without children were both actively involved in raising the children of a community. It was quite common for, women who didn't have children, who were married, presumably were experiencing infertility, to actually take in children from their sisters or their neighbors who had maybe 8 or 10 and had too many. And that wouldn't have been, like, that would be a very shocking thing today if a biological mother sent a few of her children to go live with her sister. But in the context of the time, that was just a very normal way of ensuring that children's needs were met, that this one woman has 10 kids and this other woman has none in her house, and you can, share resources and love more equitably for these children by sort of splitting the work. So I kind of was very, I don't know, I found myself very inspired by this history. Yeah, I don't want to romanticize it. Certainly women without children in the past experienced discrimination and pity and even suspicion. But the work of raising children was something that was shared. And in terms of their social role, whether or not you'd given birth to biological children, you're going to be playing a fairly similar social role. And I think we could learn from that today, that it would both help support mothers if there were more people who could participate in the raising of children. And it would mean that people without biological children would have a more clearly defined, or more clearly recognized role in the future. Again, to counter things like, Vance's comment about how people without kids of their own have no place in politics because they have no stake in the future. I think that is also a really narrow way of thinking about the relationship of people with younger generations.
I love that. We wanted to ask you about this, specifically the mother word. One of the first things that we talked about when we were writing our project statement, artist statement for this, was reclaiming the word mother, and how I have experienced the feeling of mothering without having kids of my own. Tara has experienced that, and then getting into these surveys and getting into this group, and so many people saying, I have a thing in me. And so reclaiming the idea of mother, and even maybe suggesting that every single person is a mother to some degree and has a mother in them. And it's not about gender. It's not about anything. It's about we all have, lots of different parts inside of us. We got into a lot of talk about internal families and internal, parental stuff. But I would just love to hear your personal experience, if you feel comfortable sharing, or experiences among your friends who are without children. How are you mothering in your life? What do you see are some beautiful examples of mothering from anybody?
Yeah, I mean, before I answer your question, let me offer some context. So one of the things that I raise in the book is the idea of the word mother as a noun versus as a verb. And this isn't something I came up with. This is a sort of a long-standing strain in Black feminist literature. Certainly since the 90s, probably before that the idea that a mother is not something that you are, that you become through a biological act. It is something that you do, that you can mother. And that means, as you said, that a neighbor can mother, a man can mother, a teacher can mother, a grandparent can mother. And so that allows for this like real expansion of who can do the care work. And of course, I mean, it makes sense that something like this grew out of like the Black experience in the United States. It comes from, scholars have noted that West African parenting practices are much more communal, that there's sort of less of the nuclear family and more of an intergenerational group that is doing the care work. Some of those traditions were maintained with enslaved people who were brought across the Atlantic, both to maintain tradition, but also as a way of community survival. I mean, under slavery, families are being torn apart, children from their parents. So of course, people who are non-biological parents are going to have to be parenting, mothering those children. And then after the end of slavery, this is a community obviously experiencing racism and poverty and not having access to the kinds of economic privilege that allowed for, say, stay-at-home mothers in the post-war period, or that could pay for daycare and, sort of pay someone to do mothering work. And so within that context, the idea that it is not just the biological mother, but a whole variety of people who can raise a child was about community survival, about tradition. But I think it's a really powerful concept because it both removes burden off of mothers and it involves other members of the community in the work of raising children. I mean, in terms of my own life, I will say it is hard to participate in more than what feel like kind of perfunctory ways in the raising of other people's kids. Bell Hooks, the great Black feminist theorist, has an essay where she writes about this, that she and her husband really wanted to be, to be involved in the lives of children. They didn't have children of their own, and she was like, your neighbors think it's really weird that you want to hang out with their kids. Like we don't have a language for adults to spend time with children that they're not related to. Like that's not a thing we have context for. It's not a thing we have. She was like, my neighbors are like, do you want to get paid for it? Like, you want to babysit? And she said that ultimately they kind of gave up because people just think it's really strange. And I've found sort of similarly in my own life, like, my nephews, I have a wonderful relationship with, but beyond that, my friends' kids, I try very hard. And I enjoy those relationships. I cherish them, but it does feel hard to go beyond the, like, I'll come over and bake cookies, or into the, like, I am present in their lives in a way that is sort of, equivalent to that of a parent. And I think it will require work on the part of non-parents, on the part of parents, and also on the part of society to sort of rethink what it means to be a family and who can be involved in it, and sort of who has both the right and the responsibility of caring for children.
Do you feel like, it's a little tangent, but do you feel like there's a way to mother in the world that's not just with children, like with, we've talked about in our group, like mentoring younger people, mentoring the next generation, or, mentoring people at work, I'm sure you probably have this experience teaching all the time, like that feeling of like, I am contributing to the next generation, even though it's maybe just for a season with this person, or they're not my children and I'm not trying to babysit or whatever. Like, what about other examples of how we are generating mothering energy and mothering practices, not just with children?
Yeah. I mean, something that I really cherish in my own work, that I get people's 18-year-olds, so they are adults and they have moved out of their homes for the first time, and I get to have a relationship with them that is, I hope, at least slightly formative as they're venturing out into the world. And one of my favorite things that happens every year is at graduation, I get to meet students' parents and get to see how much they have told their parents about me, which is, I don't mean that as like an ego thing. I mean it as like it's incredibly moving to look at their parents and be like, we have both had some sort of impact on this child, and certainly mine is not equivalent to yours, but it is an incredibly rewarding thing to get to have some sort of intellectual impact on young people. And those are sorts of relationships that are much easier to have than trying to hang out with your neighbor's 5-year-olds, right? I think there is like a mentoring and advising young people, whatever your field is, as they are sort of coming into adulthood, can be an incredibly rewarding thing. I also think about Jenny Offal's book Weather, where the story is basically that there's a woman who has children of her own, and she is the, assistant to a woman who has no children, who hosts a podcast about climate change. And by the end of the book, you kind of understand that in Offal's mind, both of these women are doing mothering work. One of them is mothering her own children and trying to see them through like this, doom-filled environmental future. And the other one is doing care work of sort of like informing people and trying to push for policy change that will, help make things better in the future. And what I think is so beautiful about that book is that Offal manages to show that the woman who has children of her own is very much focused on her own children, understandably, like helping them get through this climate crisis. But the woman who has no children is able to think much more broadly about like how do we think about policy change. And the mother is unable to do that because she's focused on the crisis in her own home. And I think that is, I find that idea to be so powerful, that we need both, right? We need people who are going to reproduce and care for the future by having people who will live in it, and then we also need people who can focus on maybe the bigger picture, and that these can be like collaborative endeavors.
That reminds me of, and this was actually a question we were going to ask you, but you've already answered it. But it reminds me of one of the quotes that we pulled out: supporting mothers and restoring societal value to women without children are two sides of the same coin. And that's absolutely what you're talking about. Showing that, how that can work.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that for me was really interesting about writing this book was I set out to write a book that was celebrating the lives of women without children. And I ended up writing a book that was about how society has pitted mothers and non-mothers against each other in ways that disadvantage us both. And that have both isolated mothers in the project of mothering and placed all of the responsibility for raising children on them, and that has told women without children that they're sort of societally irrelevant, right? That they have nothing to contribute. And that those are parallel things. And so instead of writing a book that celebrated one side, I came to write a book about like, well, what if we thought beyond this divide? And like, how could we create a world that was better for everyone, regardless of their reproductive choices?
Absolutely. Like we need somebody doing all the different things.
Yeah, exactly.
Peggy, your book, it is loaded with so much women's history I did not know about at all. And it made me think of that whole, speaking of language, like his history and her story, I was like, oh, this is her story. Okay. But so many things I'd never heard about, so many stories. But Ellen Peck, I'd never heard of Ellen Peck. And I had to chuckle when I was reading about her. And so she was the author of the 1971 book, The Baby Trap, which I've not read, but kind of want to. So she was unapologetically child-free and living what seemed like a very glamorous and fun-filled life with her husband, full of good food, travel, good sex, wine, everything. Johnny Carson interviewed her. She was booed off the stage, but just seemed to take it all in stride, and was just unapologetic. She's like, I am who I am, whatever. I'm going to keep doing it. And so Now yeah, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about her and then what she and her colleagues were trying to do, what they were trying to do with the National Alliance for Optional Parenthood.
Mhm. Yes. So I found her to be totally fascinating too. And um, so Ellen Peck in the early 1970s founded an organization that was originally called the American Organization of Non-Parents. And in the early 70s, she tried to inaugurate something like called Non-Parents Day. And they had a big celebration in Central Park where she brought in she crowned like a non-mother of the year and a non-father of the year. Um, and and she then her organization was really advocating for like the validity of a lifestyle that did not include children. And yes, she was willing to go out there and really really defend the lifestyle choice. And she's also sort of credited, that organization is credited with popularizing, I don't think they created the word, but popularizing the word child free and making that a word that was sort of commonly used and a thing people could identify with. And so I think like that is incredibly powerful that she was out there and willing to take the criticism. She's booed off stage on Johnny Carson. I think Carson actually said that, people reacted like she had killed the American flag and Lassie, the golden retriever. And that there was something, she was sort of willing to be controversial. And she was also willing to sort of offend feminists, women on the left as well. She wrote editorials about how, motherhood is like this thing of the past, this archaic, oppressive thing that women don't have to do anymore. So she was very out there and willing to be controversial. And I think there were, as I said, real positive impacts of that. Her organization got a lot of attention, most of it negative, but that meant that people were reading about like the increasing numbers of people not having children and seeing it as a lifestyle choice. Also, for people who organize or who joined her organization, you can read testimonies of these people that it was absolutely life-changing for them to find, just like through your project, to find other people whose lives looked like theirs because they didn't have them in their everyday life. And they, went on cruises together and they had meetups in New York on weeknights that are, other people are doing homework or whatever. And that it was sort of life-changing for people to be like, it's not that I lack something, it's that I'm I'm choosing this and it's a valid choice. That said, I mean, I think some of the history of that organization is complicated too, because Peck was really, her sales pitch was that, you can have tons more money and like a glamorous life if you don't have children, which is of course coming from a position of privilege, right? I write in the book, it doesn't occur to her that she might just be rich. It's not that she can do all these things that because she doesn't have children, it's, they have 5 houses, including an island in the Bahamas. Like they're just rich. They could have kids and still be rich. But also a lot of the people who joined the organization were white, well-off, heterosexual couples who wanted all of the privilege that was afforded to white heterosexual parents, but just didn't want the kids part. And so they really weren't advocating for societal change. They weren't really advocating for, a broadening of what family could look like. They were sort of just they were thinking kind of narrowly about it, which is a critique we can make from the present. I don't think it means that their work was any less important. They got this out there in the press and got people thinking about whether it was they got people thinking about parenthood as optional. And by the mid 1970s, the organization changes its name from the Organization of Non-Parents, as you said, to Optional Parenthood, and it gets new leadership. Ellen Peck actually gets forced out, and under the new leadership, they are, rather than advocating the lifestyle you can have by not having children, they are instead just doing ads and doing press about just trying to get people to understand that it is a choice, that you don't have to have children, which in the 70s was still like kind of a revelatory thing. And so I think in that switch from celebrating a lifestyle to just emphasizing the extent to which people have agency in their reproductive decisions was a powerful switch as well. But I think you kind of needed someone like Ellen Peck, who was willing to go out there and have basically everyone hate her, to get traction for an organization like that. And so in that, I think she's an incredibly interesting character. The Baby Trap is quite a read. There are these like real kernels of wisdom that I feel like are just as relevant in the 21st century as they were in the past, and they're also all buried in, like every man with children is having an affair with a childless woman because we're hotter and stuff like that. So she's a real character, but she seems like the kind of character who is necessary to get this conversation going.
Yeah, I love that. I think I remember early on in our research seeing a photo of the crowned non-parent sitting here. And I went and went and Googled the guy. I think he ended up having a kid actually later in life.
Interesting.
Yeah. And where they all, where are they now kind of thing.
And he was very skeptical. The first non-father of the year ended up writing a piece, I think for New York Magazine, where he said that when he was asked to do it, he was like, sure, whatever. But he didn't really, maybe because he was a guy, maybe he was just oblivious, I don't know. He didn't really think that there was discrimination against people without children. And then he said that in the wake of being crowned non-father of the year, the sort of flack he got from strangers and from people he knew, he said one of his friends actually said, it's like finding out that one of your friends is a Nazi. And he was like, oh, maybe this discrimination is real after all. So I think he's sort of an interesting character. I didn't know that he went on to have kids.
He had one son much later, like his second or third marriage or something.
Interesting.
That actually brings up a point that we did not even think about, but Tara knows what I'm going to say. One of the biggest things about deciding to make our project for women identifying people, is the fact that, there is a specific kind of onslaught that you receive as someone who is perceived as having the ability to create children. And we shared a lot of stories in our group about and even a lot of the women went and asked their male partners or their male friends, like, have you experienced this? And just like, oh, wow, it's a completely different thing.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, this is another thing I've been thinking about a lot this summer, because of course Harris running for president has generated all this talk about women without children. Of course, she would be the 6th president without biological children. It's just that the other 5 were dudes, right? So it doesn't register in the same way. And in fact, my favorite story is that George Washington, the first president, did not have biological children. And in fact, his contemporaries, far from seeing that as a problem, they thought that was a great thing. That was part of, that was a vote in his favor for making him the first president, because they had just thrown off a king, and what do kings do? They pass it on to their sons. And here's a guy who doesn't have any heirs. And so they were thinking that, this is someone who will give up the throne. This isn't going to become the Washington dynasty. And I mean, and talk about, we were just talking earlier about like ways of conceiving about having a stake in the future. Like, these are the founding fathers who were like, we would prefer it if it is not your children that you're caring about. They thought he had total ability to care for the future of the nation. And in fact, that he had a better ability because he didn't have children to care for. So yeah, I mean, I think it's clear to those of us who are living it, but also historically that this is a expectation that falls on women and women alone.
It really, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna go kind of off into just what do you think about this?
Sure.
We in having these conversations and noticing on social media and in the media in general, like more and more parents are opening up about the reality and the truth. Like, it is hard. It is actually hard. No one warned me about this. I wish someone would have told me about this. We've seen it with our friends who didn't see it, didn't know what they were in for, and all this kind of stuff. And then we have even had a lot of women, and I have, and Tara has experienced that parents are even feeling more comfortable talking about the reality of the difficulties with people who don't have children than with other parents. Have you noticed that? What do you think about that?
Yes, I've noticed that. Since having published my book, one of the most surprising things to me has been the strong reaction from mothers. I did a radio call-in show in Chicago where, they just opened the phone lines, and it was probably like 90% of the callers that I talked to were mothers who were calling in to talk about how hard it was to be a mother. And I think, and I've heard that at book events. I've in my own life, it has been, people with kids who have reacted most strongly to the book positively. I mean, that they feel really validated by the book, and that I think I become a safe place to talk about all of the ways that it is hard. So yeah, absolutely. And in part, that is validating for me about one of the big revelations I had when I was writing the book, which was that the same reasons that women give for not having kids today, which, like I keep saying, are financial, economic, their jobs, support networks, the world we live in. These are the same reasons why it is hard to be a parent. And so it's not that we are like reacting to totally different things. It's that we're all subject to the same sort of context in which it is hard to be a parent. And we're making different reproductive decisions in response to that context, but it's not that we're living in sort of separate universes. And so, it kind of makes sense to me that parents feel validated by the book, because the reasons I'm giving for not having kids are the same reasons that it is hard to have kids. And I kind of, I've been glad to see that a little bit, because it's a I think it's something that we can take solidarity from, that we can find a common ground there, and then work to create a better society where, these factors don't exist, and maybe people do feel like the reproductive decisions are more free, they have more choice, and also parents are sort of suffering less.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I think it always comes back to community for me. I think all my life, anytime that I have come out of isolation and started talking with other people about what I was actually experiencing, other people were like, "Oh, me too." And then it just felt less, it just freed me from that feeling of being like all alone in whatever the experience was. It really does come back to that. And it's crazy how much we need it. We don't even know how much we need it because we've been tricked into thinking that.
Right.
Anyway, Hera.
Okay. So again, we touched on this a little bit, but we've heard the many stereotypes of people without children: selfish, self-centered, lonely, they're miserable, they're shallow, they're sad cat ladies, they want to make everybody else miserable, etc. Now, you mentioned this Norwegian sociologist, Thomas Hansen. And so you talk about how he's narrowed down the stereotypes to like 3 main stereotypes. This really cracked me up. Okay, stereotype 1, that children make people happy. Therefore, people without children are less happy than parents. Stereotype 2, that people without children live lonely, empty lives, so they are less happy than parents. Stereotype 3, that people without children have prioritized pleasure and freedom, time with friends, romance, good food, nice houses, and travel over parenthood. So when I read number 3, compared to 1 and 2, I laughed out loud. But do you feel that these ideas are shifting? That these stereotypes are shifting, especially in this moment in our country, like where we have people like J.D. Vance butting up against photos like of Taylor Swift holding her cats?
Yeah, I mean, I did too. I that also made me laugh. And then he goes on in like the way only an academic can to comment very dryly, like stereotype 3 sounds like a pretty happy group. If you ask me, like they sound pretty okay. Um, and and yeah, I mean, I had just never thought about it that way, that like somehow we think of them as miserable and also like living these hedonistic lives that prioritize pleasure and fun. Like how do we believe both of these things at the same time? I mean, a couple of thoughts on that. One is that there are studies sort of very consistently that back up in the United States that people without children are happier than parents. And that, you know, these are surveys, but that people without children report higher levels of happiness than parents of any kind. And that's step parents, biological parents, adoptive parents, parents of adult children who have left, parents of young children. People without kids report being happier. The researchers always point out that this is not because of the children, because if you look at other countries, if you look at France, if you look at the Scandinavian countries where there is more support for parents, parents actually report higher levels of happiness than people without kids. So it's not about the kids, it's about the policy context that is particularly acute in the United States that make it very hard to parent, and that therefore, you know, parents are less happy. So there's that piece. Another thing that kind of surprised me a little bit, but in a good way, since publishing the book, is that the response from people younger than me, like Gen Z, people come to my book talks who are 10 years younger than me, and seeing too much reflection of the angst or the fraughtness of the question of whether or not to have kids, and too little like celebration of a child-free lifestyle. And in part that's genre, right? Like the work of a historian is not to celebrate any particular kind of lifestyle, it's to tell a history. But it's also because I was trying to sort of talk about a broader range of reproductive experiences, not just, you know, the history of the child-free movement. That would be a very different book. It would be a fascinating book, but it's a different book. But I have taken a lot of hope from the idea that young people see my book as sort of too small c conservative, that they've moved beyond this like fraughtness, this sort of like deeply emotional experience of deciding whether or not to have kids. And many of them are just like, my life is going to be awesome without kids. Like, I don't want them. I'm going to have a grand old time. And they're willing to sort of say that openly. They're willing to own that. Even in the response to J.D. Vance's childless cat ladies comment, it just didn't stick as an insult. Like the whole internet was like, yeah, let's make t-shirts, you know, like childless cat ladies for Kamala. It seems like the sort of the willingness to just claim that as an identity is much more open. It's much more joyful in people even 10 years younger than me. And I think that's a really hopeful thing. And it also suggests that stereotypes are going to change as you know, as they age. That's certainly not a thing that I felt at 25, but that seems to be a very open conversation among people who are 25 right now.
Yeah, and we've experienced that within the Marco Polo group too.
Interesting.
Because we do have, I'm not sure how young the youngest person is in that group, but we have some folks who are in their mid-20s, and then folks who are, you know, 30s, 40s, and then some folks in their 50s, I think too, probably early 50s. But the younger folks are like, yeah, no big deal, NBD, whatever, you know? So that is very refreshing and hopeful to see.
Yeah, I think it's just cool to think about a world with all different kinds of people. Choose your future, and what does that world look like? We're not all trying to do the same thing and, you know, stressing each other out about not doing the same thing. Okay, so final question for you is, if you could write a letter to the children that you decided not to bring into this world, what would you say to them?
I want to say it's a column from years ago, Dear Sugar, I think, where she writes this piece called The Ghost Ship That Didn't Carry Us. And she writes about, that there are these two lives that you're living. Specifically, someone wrote in to ask about whether or not they should have a child, and she writes about that there are these two lives that you're always going to have. Whichever decision you make, the other one is going to be the ghost ship that you can sort of barely see in the mist, that is going parallel to you. And I've always thought that was kind of lovely, because the idea is that, like, there isn't a right choice. It's that whatever choice you make will lead to the life that you're going to live. And that other life will always be sort of like this shadowy could have been, but it's not like you're going to choose wrong necessarily. And then, like, get to some point where you realize that it was the wrong decision. It's just that there are these two lives and you can only live one of them. And I think, the idea of the realist is sort of recognizing that you can't test what it would be like to have a child. You can only make the best decision that you can now, and sort of trust that future you will, make the best out of that life, and that is just sort of the way it's going to be. And I found great comfort in the idea that there isn't a wrong choice. There are just like multiple lives, and every choice we make leads to a different life that we're going to live. And there's sort of joy and pain in every life that you can choose.
And that path not taken, that road not taken, that has come up,
God, so many times.
in the research, in the chat group, in the letters, and
I think also part of that was the grieving process. That I think, if you don't want to be stuck on that question the rest of your life, or 20 years from now be like, oh, do I regret it? Like, there has to be a grieving process where you grieve the path that you did not take, and look at it, acknowledge it. I am intentionally choosing not to. It is exactly that poem. I'm intentionally choosing not to go down that road, and I know I probably won't come back to this place again.
Right.
So let's take a minute and feel those feelings and grieve that, and then full bore go head on into whatever the choice is that we made.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time, Peggy. This is amazing. Oh my God, so incredible. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wow. Okay. That was amazing. Thank you so much, Peggy. Incredible conversation. I'm so inspired. Yeah, I just feel like I learned so much. Even after reading the book, even talking to her more, it's just like, oh my God, I want to know even more. There's so much to this.
Peggy, thank you so much. And we will link to her website on the episode page. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.